This is one in a series of lectures for Political Science 101, Principles of Political Science, and we'll be talking about Huntington, Revolution and Political Order. We have to be able to distinguish between the various types of changes that would happen during the process of modernization. And one of those changes that's probably most interesting is revolution. Now, as I've stated before in another lecture, revolution is a complete raising of all that exists, um, institutions, social forces. So while it seems attractive on some level, it rips everything so far apart that you're left rebuilding everything, all the structures. The problem with that, of course, is that takes more time. And as you're spending time rebuilding those structures, the rest of the world is moving forward, modernizing. So you're playing catch up under a greater limitation because revolution, by its nature, is rapid, fundamental, and violent change. It doesn't happen over a prolonged period. Now, there may be some discontent and there may be some grumblings, but basically, when it does occur, it happens quickly. Again, it's rapid, it's fundamental, and it's violent change. So, what changes? Well, pretty much everything. All the dominant values in the society, which are so critical for there being social forces and a agreement about what matters and what does not matter. The myths. All societies have myths upon which they're built that justify the regime, that um, codify exactly what the rules are that govern and support those. In America, for example, when we talk about our myths, we talk about the founding fathers. We make them into something that is beyond human. They seem infallible. They seem perfect on some level. The moment in time they come together seems to be tied to some destiny of sorts. So the myths are necessary, like democracy, uh, the importance of it. Even American exceptionalism is based on a series of myths, and that American exceptionalism is a fundamental uh, core value that is supported by and perpetuated by myths. American exceptionalism is that somehow Americans think that they're exceptional, that compared to the rest of the world, that Americans bring something unique to the table, that Americans somehow, in America, are necessary in the entire process of development and modernization. Um, Again, it's rapid, fundamental, and violent change, not just in the values and the myths, but in the political institutions. This is probably where it's most obvious. The values and the myths sort of have to develop over time, and they're washed away pretty quickly. But to develop new ones takes some time. But political institutions, we can readily see the destruction of those because they're really part of the old order. So they're the first things to go. So what was once the political structure now is gone. And that means there really is no political structure left. And it has to be replaced. Typically, after revolution, it's the revolutionary leaders that begin to dictate, and eventually one leader, and restructures things. But it doesn't have all the component parts that are necessary for political institutions to really survive in the long run. That is to say, they're not necessarily interested in meeting the demands of the social forces. They're not necessarily well developed. They're not, power is not dispersed. So therefore, policy initiatives are few, but the adoptions of those policies are many. Unfortunately, the policies that are few come from the leadership and don't really embody the wants, desires, the needs of the social forces who, more often than not, are concerned about expressing exactly what they feel, because what they feel could actually be problematic in terms of their survival. Really that simple. The social structure is also completely destroyed. That means that not only the social forces, but the relationship, between those in the society, whatever existed before, however it existed before, socially, it's gone. So that social structure, that's part of the norms, really supported again by the values and the myths, is gone. It needs to be replaced because social structure is key to the formation of social forces. If there is no structure, there's no way for those social forces to come together. So as you can see, revolution really reaches into the heart of the process of modernization and the institutions that must be present for modernization to move forward, and it's gone. How do you move from there? The leadership also changes rapidly. You see it over and over again, where those that were in power are no longer in power, and they usually either are held by the new regime and executed, imprisoned, or they manage to get sort of out of town before it becomes obvious that they're going to be pulled in by the new regime, and not only is their leadership and their governance and their control over, but probably their lives as well. And everything changes again in government activities and policies, as I've mentioned. So it's absolutely a complete tearing apart of the society. And we can see this over and over again with the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. All of these revolutions, if you compare them, they have pretty much the same structure. It's rapid, it's fundamental and violent change in the dominant values and myths and institutions and social structure and leadership and government activities and policies. Yes, that all goes away. But in each case, if you look at them, you'll notice that the regime that comes in is usually dictatorial. On some level, with everything completely destroyed, what other way can you begin to reform the structure other than someone take the lead? Now, that doesn't mean that we like that this dictatorial rule gets put in place, but when you consider there's nothing else there, it creates a power vacuum. And that power vacuum is easily filled by some dominant leader of the revolution. Keep in mind that revolutions are very rare. It's a historic phenomenon. You don't see it on a regular basis. Now, I've said it before, and now it bears repeating here. The American Revolution was not a revolution, because for the most part, it wasn't rapid and fundamental violent change. It took a long time. The dominant values and myths and institutions and social structures, leadership, all of that doesn't change. The leadership transfers, but everything else remains intact. It's really a war of independence, but on some level, it's a lot sexier, if you will, to say a revolution occurred. A revolution is not a good thing. Again, in the process of modernization, a revolution just tears everything down, and that society not only stops modernizing, but usually takes many steps backwards, and then sits there for an indeterminate amount of time until it evolves. Because eventually, dictatorial rule can't sustain itself. Why? Because the leadership dies and creates a power vacuum. And typically there are others that are ready to step into that position, but by then there are already more moderate voices beginning to express themselves. You can only really suppress the people for so long, and then they will strike back. As the saying goes, you don't worry about the middle-class intelligentsia. They're always upset. It's when the farmers put down the pitchforks and pick up the guns, that's when you have a problem. So revolution is not necessarily a dominant characteristic of the process of modernization, but is certainly one way that things can occur or happen along the road. If you recall in an earlier lecture, when we talked about modernizing and dividing that structure into quadrants, you've got the first traditional, pretty stable, and the last quadrant, more modern, pretty stable. And if you recall, the transition through that second quadrant and third becomes really problematic for the reasons I mentioned previously. But keep in mind that in that second quadrant is where there's usually enough stress on the speed at which modernization has to happen and the movement forward that there's a backlash. If there's going to be a revolution, it's going to probably appear in that second quadrant or the beginning of the third quadrant. And where it happens, you get the society just locking down. No movement forward. Now, we should separate revolutions from insurrections and rebellions. Okay? Insurrections and rebellions, they can change policies and leaders, even political institutions. But there's no social, structural values that really are at stake, not in a major way. In fact, the rebellion could be about the social structures not being listened to. That basically the political institutions are not meeting the demands of the people. Now, this could be differentiated from a coup d'etat. Here, you've got a change only in leadership, right? Perhaps some policies, but for the most part, you've got a dictatorial leader who's usually overthrown by another, usually a military leader that's close to the dominant leader. And so we really have a change only in leadership. We don't really have a change in the structure that's in place. It just now serves, that structure does, a new leader. Okay, then there's the War of Independence, which is what we had in America. And there it's just simply a struggle of one community against an alien community. In America, that was the British. It doesn't necessarily involve all those major changes in the social structure that we talked about, or the political institutions. It's probably the mildest form, if I can express it that way, of resisting, the rule of others. Along the road of modernization, all these things set you back somewhat. But of all of those, probably least detrimental is the War of Independence. So if you look at revolution as being the most destructive to the process, and insurrections and rebellions following that, and a coup d'etat after that, a War of Independence is relatively a mild form. I don't mean to minimize it. There are things that go on, but you're not destroying everything, right? So the key to modernization and the modernization outlook is that it is within the power of individuals to control and change their environment. Not just the ability, but the right. So along the road, if you don't have in place, social forces that have the power to control and change the environment, then you've got an issue. It's just a matter of time. Okay, so again, I want to emphasize, you're not going to have revolution in highly traditional societies. Why? There's very low levels of social and economic complexity. How can there be? You're talking about, the tribe. And you're not going to have in highly modern societies because you have in place the social forces and the political institutions and a distribution of power that stabilizes the society. If you think about America, we might criticize America for being overly bureaucratic, but in many ways that bureaucracy creates a very wide foundation with specialized, authority, if you will, in many different segments. So even if we wanted to revolt against the American government, where do you start? You could get rid of the federal government, which would be very difficult, but then you still have the state governments. You can get rid of the state governments, but then you've got the city structures, and then you've got the towns. So power is so dispersed and exists on so many levels, and is, manifests itself in many different parts of bureaucracies dealing with many different policies, that it's hard to sort of erase all of that. Plus, because you have such specialization based on policy issues, it's hard to get your mind around how you would then move forward and deal with those. So the reason why a modernized society is so stable is because power is dispersed, issues are complex, social forces have outlets like voting or taking part in local activities. And so the social forces, although frustrated, typically do not, it does not rise. That frustration doesn't rise to revolution because the political institutions will respond. Maybe not always in the way we would like, but they'll respond. So if you look at America's situation presently, with the 1% holding so much of the wealth, there is really an unsettling of the general population when they recognize that there's very little resources of the country's resources are held by most people. That a large percentage of America's assets are controlled by that 1%. A large measure of the gross domestic product, gross national product, is also controlled by that 1%. So the gap is widening, and the classes are dividing. And this is a very dangerous thing, even in a modern society, because once you've modernized, there should be a general connection between the social forces and the political institutions to such an extent that no one, no class, no group can really dominate the process in a way that favors them. It's corrupt, or as Locke would say, it's gluttonous. So we have that at present. And the disparity in income and the lack of job opportunities, all of these things begin to eat out the sustenance of Americans. Now the question is, Americans are docile. And as I said, it's a modern society. So how much wiggle room do the political institutions and the elite class have before something horrific happens? That is to say, how long can this situation continue before the average American feels, I've got nothing to lose? And my structure here, my political structure, doesn't hear me. And what's left to do? Now, hopefully, I doubt very much it would be a revolution, but maybe through elections we could have, in a very structured democratic way, replacement, an insurrection, if you will. I mean, that's probably not going to even happen. It might be in its own strange way, a war of independence, not casting off a foreign body, but maybe a class. This is really problematic. And one can only imagine how America, and its people might deal with the growing, gap between the haves and the have-nots. America is the oldest form of government on the face of the earth. Not the oldest country, but the oldest form of government. So we're really on the cutting edge of democracy. No one's been out this far before. So we really don't have other experiences or the experience of others to look at and to sort of model ourselves after or tweak. We're out there on the cutting edge, and every step we make could lead us in a direction we don't want to go. And we have no one else, as I've said, that we can look to give us direction. So we're an experiment. And it's an experiment that is turning in a direction that seems very dangerous in terms of the structure, the social structure. Now, at present, one could argue that the technology, as much as we embrace it, has really hurt Americans because it's allowed Americans to basically lose their jobs as more and more automation, as computers handle more and more, as overseas labor markets are more attractive because they can create profit, greater profit because their labor costs are so low, and jobs leave America. yeah, it's going to leave most Americans in greater uh, difficulty. You couple that with the promise of education being a way to lift yourself out of your lower class or lower middle class position, and the American dream, the myth is that you could move up, but that's not happening. It only takes a while before you begin to realize that something's not right. And then you've received the education you've been told, you've invested in it, that you've been told will work in moving you up, you've invested in it, and now you're deeply in debt with loans and no job. So, and this is happening, by the way, to probably the most, well, reactionary group, that is students, the middle class intelligentsia. The students, they have enough time on their hands and they know enough to want to react. So the poor are too busy surviving day to day, and the adults or the people that have lived on the system for a long time, they've either accepted it or are functioning within it. But as the young look at the horizon and see that there's no light rising, they've got to begin to think, well, everything we were told was either a lie or is not capable any longer of really being a reality. And so that means social structures will begin to be stretched. And so I can't predict where it's going to go, but I can tell you that when you think about revolution, it's not going to happen in traditional societies or highly modernized societies, but it's going to happen where societies have experienced some social and economic development, and where the process of political modernization and political development have lagged behind the process of social and economic reforms. Then political modernization, political development, begin to lag behind. In other words, there's a gap. You're moving along and you expect that things are going to improve. And when those things don't improve, or the opportunities are not there, then what begins to happen is there is a growing sense of futility, that the promise that I've lived with and embraced, the values, the myths, all are not valuable anymore. So if you have certain conditions in the political institutions and certain circumstances among the social forces, then you're going to probably have revolution. So what do we mean by the conditions in political institutions? Well, the political institutions are supposed to be providing channels, right, for participation of new social forces in politics and new elites in the government. There's a moving up, and within that structure, and the social forces desire some sort of return on that investment, right? They want to be able to participate based on their needs. And what you get is these important symbolic and material gains that feed back into the social forces and reinforce their faith in that process. So if you think about those groups and you think about the social forces and their expectations, and you think about the political institutions that are either incapable because of their structure or have been corrupted so much by typically those classes in power. What we're really saying here is that the political institutions, in one way or another, have been made incapable of performing their function, either because they are not functionally sound or because they are now controlled by forces that are not concerned with the social forces in general, but concerned with their own class. Warren Buffett has said, very wealthy man, has said that there is class warfare and his class is winning. And I would argue, and he's not saying that in any in-your-face sort of way, he's stating a fact, almost trying to explain that this is not good. Nevertheless, his fortunes continue. There are more billionaires in America of the top 1,000 billionaires, 630 plus, live in America. So there are a lot of people that have prospered tremendously. It's not just billionaires, it's people that are worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So my point here is that there is class warfare. And it depends now how class warfare, the stability, the movement forward, depends upon how class warfare mixes with democratic structures. No one's been there before. We don't really know. Anyone that tells you they understand the direction of things is probably taking a rather, long and inaccurate, or certainly, weak view of the future. In other words, they're predicting something they can't really predict. Having said that, let me predict something. The situation can't stay as it is, and so consequently something will have to change. Those forces, that group, that class that has the resources, no one wants to give up power or their resources. The question is, what are the masses willing to accept? How will this all be worked out? One way it could be worked out is, believe it or not, at the voting booth, in the voting booth. You could vote the bums out. Put people in, maybe a third party that's dedicated to bringing back the American dream. Returning to values that once made the nation move forward. And if you get enough people from that party in positions of power, they could begin, if they don't become corrupted themselves, to undo some of the corruption and structures that don't help the average American live that American dream. Now, let's assume they don't become corrupted. We still have another problem, which is, or two. One is that they're capable of governing. That's a rather large unknown. The second thing is the elite class has a lot of ties, a lot of control in the society in terms of employment, in terms of the gross national product. If they begin to pull from America, what happens to America's assets? Now you can control that, but that would take some time to control assets leaving the country. And since this is not a revolution, or would not be a revolution, and it wouldn't be sudden, there'd be plenty of time for the elites to get a sense that things are not going well, and move their assets out of reach. So revolution, in order for that to occur, it's got to be an alienation of many groups. And it's got to be a frustration for many groups at the same time. And there has to be a willingness to work together between those alienated and those frustrated, those that are kept outside, and those that believe in the structure but it's not producing. And what begins to happen is there is an expectation when things become worse that somehow the political institutions and the social forces will work all this out. Well, what begins to happen when things reach a point of such disparity in wealth is there's a gap between what people expect, the social forces expect the political institutions to do, and the ability of the political institutions to do those things. What's interesting here is that the political institutions, in order to satisfy the social forces, begin to promise that this must change and that must change. And you'll get political leaders in campaigns that state this right out, straightforward, that this has got to change. And this raises the hopes of people, of those social forces. And when that person or that group or that party is elected, and that's not the outcome, then there's a problem. What happens is just structuring for the people what you're going to do will raise expectations. These people are going to take power and they're going to do and care for us. And so people get excited. They believe. And then what happens is those political institutions don't deliver. So the gap, rising expectations, right? Rising expectations make it more difficult for the political institutions to meet those expectations. But at the same time, a new party coming in or a new political leaders coming in have to promise something. And of course, and the desire to get elected, the likelihood that they'll